Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest edition of Free Thought Hour. First of all, I've got to make apologies because Tercia can't be with us today. She's got husband fetching from the airport duties to perform, so we've had to give her some time off. So it's just me and Alan Colquhoun, our guest. Hello, Alan. How the devil are you?
Hello, good evening, John. Well, good evening from where I'm sitting in Edinburgh. Thank you very much. I'm well, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm very grateful that you invited me on. It's a privilege, and well, hopefully I can acquit myself well enough once we get into things.
One of your fans has already given you well-wishing. Look.
Oh, that'll be my mother.
Oh dear! Thank heaven for mother. Yes. So we met in some social media circumstance, I think, and I found myself agreeing with pretty much everything you said. So I did what I do in the cases of meeting somebody like that. I tried to reel you in as a guest for this show, and you're definitely a kindred spirit, but how did you get to be this Alan Colquhoun in Edinburgh that you are today?
Well, it's hard to know how best to summarize the answer to that question to make it relevant to why we're here tonight. But I suppose that the essence of the question is how did I come to be interested in philosophy? And really, I suppose that happened through music. Pretty much how anyone gets interested in philosophy to begin with. Let's say you're a mathematician and you're working with numbers in all your life long, and then a couple of decades into that, it suddenly strikes you one day. Well, hang on a minute, what are these things called numbers that I use every day? Where do they come from? What are their existence and identity conditions? Well, the same thing happened with me in music. One day I woke up and I thought, well, wait a minute, what is this thing called music? How does it work? Did it evolve? It must have done, given that everything else we do evolved. In which case, what's its evolutionary explanation, if it has one, etc., etc. So that was the segue into philosophy. That's what gripped me from the start. But then I broadened my interest in philosophy to philosophy of mind, and really going from philosophy of value, I suppose, aesthetic value, and an interest that I think we all have, a basic interest in morality and moral value, into philosophy of mind. So, epistemology, the ontology of mind. What kind of a thing is it? The mind? Is it a kind of thing at all? Would an inventory of all the objects in the world contain any minds, or are minds just relations to things? That kind of thing. Those kind of questions. So yeah, and that all happened to me some 25 years ago ish, and I've just read about it ever since. You can see about a quarter of my library behind me here. This stretches from the floor to the ceiling, and I've got another 4 shelves like this. Wow. And there isn't a book I haven't read on the topic, and not just read, but read again and again and again and again, as you have to do in philosophy, because you can never absorb everything in one reading. It's usually terribly abstruse. These, especially if you read the ancient philosophers, it's hard to know what they're going on about most of the time. So
yes.
So yeah, that takes up almost all of my time. Of course, I still play the piano, and I try now to recover my skills as an oboist. Although that's some stomach surgery a year ago made that very, very hard.
Oh dear.
So yes. I used to be as good an oboist as I am a pianist, but not anymore. Not anymore, unfortunately.
Well, I too had a musical background many years ago. Like you, I couldn't do it now, because after 40 years of not doing it, you lose the skills, don't you? So, but I was in a number of bands back in the early 80s, and we went out and gigged it and got paid, and we had 3-part harmony. It was fun. I loved it.
That's nice. But yeah. Hopefully that will be relevant when we come to talk about some of the things we've agreed to talk about today.
Yes, indeed. Yes. But you style yourself as deontological realist on
Yeah.
Facebook, don't you? And you use a picture of somebody much older.
Well, that's a manipulated picture of myself.
Oh, future you.
That's future me, filtered through Face app. I just thought it was fun, so I put it on there.
Yes.
Not just fun, but kind of interesting in a way that's hard to put words around. You know, it really is I mean, I can personally see the likeness, but
Yes.
but it's not really me. You know, it's some computer's idea of what I will look like in the future.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of fun.
Yes. And computers are increasingly coming to have what seems like ideas, aren't they? Have you met ChatGPT?
Beg your pardon. Have I met whom? Who?
ChatGPT.
No. Oh, yes, I have actually. I have. A friend of mine, or a Twitter friend of mine, posted some of my questions to that AI and showed me. That's Eric Clancy. I don't know if he's watching just now, but he'll be delighted that we've picked up on this. Actually, he showed me some of the computer's responses to my questions, and we had a bit of fun testing their adequacy. That was interesting, actually. That was about, funnily enough, it's about something we might touch on later. It was about the question of whether purely aesthetic propositions, so musical propositions, say, whether there is such a thing, and if so, whether they can be true or not. Do they admit of truth? And if so, how does that work? You know, how can you, if truth is disquotational, as the philosophers tell us it is, well, how can you disquote something that isn't even meaningful in the way that words can be?
Yes.
You know? So
isn't it impressive? This software it's going to it solved the Turing test, hasn't it? I mean, you can have a conversation with that and be impressed to the extent that you think it was human.
Yeah. To the extent that the Turing test is an adequate test for consciousness, it pretty much solves that test. Yeah, you can produce a simulacrum of conscious speech that is capable of convincing many, perhaps even most, probably not all, humans that it is conscious, even though it isn't, or even though they've no other reason to think it is. I mean, how could you ever know? The only way you can ever know that anything's conscious is by rational inference from its behavior. And if speech is the only thing you've got to go on, then fine, you know, you make your rational inference and you may be correct or incorrect.
Yeah.
But you know, the problem I've got with the Turing test is that it's too linguistic, really. You know, it would mean that, you know, infant humans who, you know, less than 3 years old are not conscious, or horses are not conscious. You know, which seems a bit too far fetched. You know.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
so,
we can't rule out our infants, can we? No. So they've actually given ChatGPT some exams to do in various fields. I can't remember where, but I read this today, and it's passed. So it's going to be a nightmare for the assessors.
That's really interesting. I would love to know if it had an examination in, let's say, imagine, and again, I'm trying to make this relevant to the kinds of things we'll get on to talking about, but if it was examined in comprehension of literature, or comprehension of the plot line of a movie, say, whether or not it could understand and grapple with the moral complexity of certain works of literature and certain movies, say, or plays, or whatever. I'd be very interested in that, because my feeling is that it probably could not. What you would see is regurgitating a lot of descriptions of how people typically respond to and typically react to, instead of assessing it for itself on its actual value.
I wouldn't put any money on it doing that. No.
Yeah.
So you mentioned music and speech, and there's another item of news today, which is reported on the BBC, is about this fantastic talent. She's a female singer and actress, and there's records of her singing before she could speak, when she was just a tiny toddler, composing her own songs.
Interesting.
So her own melodies, you know. So, and there is a line of thought which suggests that music did come before speech in an animal communication sense, you know, because we've got the howler monkeys, haven't we? They're very musical.
We do.
And
we've got birds as well that seem to have some kind of individual tunes of one kind or another. It's different from human music, I would say. It's not got that combinatorial essence that characterizes human music, but it is tuneful, melodic, if you like. It has a certain. I think, you know, there have been human composers that have incorporated birdsong into their music. Messiaen, most notably, perhaps. So there's certainly, at the very, very least, there's a radical similarity there. You know, it's difficult to pick apart where the differences lie. I mentioned combinatorics. The theory that says that music somehow predates or preordains our speech capacity it's not one that I've really grappled with too much, but it strikes me as a little cart before the horse, just because of the combinatorial nature of human music. But then again, maybe that was something that came later once we had evolved tool use and speech and so on.
Well, the original human music wasn't very combinatorial, was it? It was plain song, just one melody line.
Yeah, in the Middle Ages, that's true. That's true. That's all they allowed, I think. I think they were sort of horribly offended by harmony in those days,
right.
for religious reasons.
It was a taboo. Yes.
Well, I think so. Yeah, I believe it was. Yeah. The more elaborate the harmony, the more encouraging of the devil it was reckoned to be by the authorities. Probably just because they didn't understand what they were dealing with and didn't want to be accepting novelty, even creative novelty of any kind of genius. I mean, my own. It's hard to pick a favorite theory of the origins of music. There are so many of them, but I like Steven Pinker's theory that music is I think he puts it by saying it's a kind of cheesecake for the mind. You know, this idea that it tantalizes our linguistic module in the mind. You know, it gives us just enough to pin our attention on, and then whips it away before it can mean anything proper in the way that linguistic semantics works. You know, that it seems to have meaning, but not in the way that language can have meaning, and it's difficult to know whether it has any truth about it, whether truth is even applicable, even though it can be meaningful. You know, it's a very puzzling thing, and it could be simply that intrigue that Pinker's idea is. Sorry, just not to distract myself. His idea. His idea was that it just tantalizes the mind and stimulates the language centers, if you like. You know.
Interesting. Because I had a chat with Steven Pinker a little while ago, back in November, and there's a video of that I think it's been put up now on the Atheism UK channel, not my own channel, because I was wearing my other hat. I'm the president of Atheism UK, and I was hosting an event in London and talking to Steven Pinker over the internet.
Wow. Well, he's a hero to many people, I think. He's certainly one of my heroes. I was fortunate enough to meet him nearly 13 years ago now in Glasgow, where I got a chance to speak to him during an event and after the event, and it was a privilege of my lifetime to have a conversation on topics of mutual interest with someone as eloquent and really capable as he is. He's a very, very capable thinker.
Absolutely, yes, a hero of mine too. Yes, indeed. Yeah. So, should we take a look at your slides, because you kindly produced a few slides?
Yeah, I mean, now we're 15 minutes into the 1 hour we've got. I don't know whether I'm going to have to rush through this in any way, but you'll be the judge of that, I think.
I'm sorry, I've taken it in free-form chat. We've used up a quarter of our time. Oh dear.
Yeah, you're all right, John. You're all right.
Here we go. What is philosophy? Well, I had a chat with A.C. Grayling. Sorry about all these names I'm dropping. I suggested to him that philosophy was thought. What do you say?
Well, it's that. I mean, that's what can I say about that? Yeah, it involves thinking. That's for sure. there are many ideas about what philosophy consists in ultimately, and there is a whole branch of philosophy or meta-philosophy asking questions about, well, why are we doing philosophy? What have we been doing all this 2.5 millennia? What is it? The answer to that question that strikes me as the most satisfactory out of all of the available answers is it's really an answer that has its roots in the Chomskyan idea of the difference between what he called mysteries on the one hand and puzzles on the other. Now, a mystery, well, rather start with a puzzle. A puzzle is just something that a question whose answer lies within our cognitive abilities to explain.
We can solve it.
Yeah, we can solve it. Even if we don't know what the answer is in principle, we can at least in principle understand what an answer would look like.
Yes.
And devise some means of deriving the answer we're looking for on the basis of the structure of what counts as an explanation to us. That's a puzzle. So a question like, for example, how many? There can even be unanswerable questions. So questions that we can't answer, like how many dinosaurs were there? Right? We're never going to be able to answer that question, and we know we can't. But we at least know what form an answer would take.
Yes. Yes.
And the kind of principles that we would have to employ if we ever went searching for that answer, or we ever tried to derive that answer. It's not outside of the cognitive limits that I'm about to talk about when I talk about what he means by mystery. A mystery, on the other hand, is a question, let's say, whose answer lies outside of the bounds of our capability to reason or to grapple with and to answer properly, adequately. So that would certainly include all the questions about consciousness, about how it's possible. It's usually kind of questions that take the form, how possible? How is that possible? Not all questions of that type, of course, but it's the questions you typically find philosophers dealing with. So how is pain possible? It's how does something which isn't pain, like a bunch of neurons and electricity being passed through them, myelin sheath and all the rest of it. How does something that isn't pain become painful? Some transduction occurs, right? But we cannot even begin to imagine what that is, what that looks like, the form it should take. So questions of that type. What is a thought? How is thought possible? How does thought acquire its content? Brentano's problem, So there's a huge number of philosophical problems, of course, but they all have that form. So that was what that's the view that I take of philosophy is that philosophy is the study of questions whose answers defy our ability adequately to explain or to answer. And there's a lot of evidence for that too in the history of philosophy. You can see philosophers over 2.5 millennia at least consistently bumping their head against the ceiling of what we're capable of addressing and answering. And it's the same old questions getting recycled over and over again. The same old solutions appearing in the same model every time they fail to answer. It's always because they've tried to reduce it, or they've kept it as irreducible, or they've got some magical solution, or they regard this the property under scrutiny as if it were eliminable in some way. So, for example, the eliminative solution to the problem of how is pain possible is just to say, well, pain is just an illusion. Nothing's painful. We've just got these neurons, and they just do that, and that's enough, right? Pain is just, it's kind of epiphenomenal. Just hanging on in there, it's not doing anything, But I think that's inadequate, because I think pain is painful. That's all it is. It really is painful. And it's
constructed in the brain from the signals that are brought by the neurons, and yet the brain itself doesn't feel pain because it doesn't have any pain receptors in it. So
that's an irony. Yeah, exactly. And colors are similar, of course, as well. The wavelengths of light are not colored, but we see them as colored.
Yes. And we have specific vision cells in our retina, rods and cones. Well, rods are for the black and white intensity, but cones 3 types of cones. Some people have 4, and they are tuned to particular frequencies. But then when that signal gets back to the brain, it's suddenly turned into a color. So
colors, and yet colors appear to qualify external objects. You can't see external objects without seeing them as colored, even though they're not colored. So
this, of course, is before the invention of color photography and color technology, color TV, because, of course, back then the world was just black and white.
Yeah, who knows what the world really looks like, because we're condemned to toil within the sort of subjective grid through which we perceive the world, you know. So colors, tastes, smells, sounds, all of these things are, you know, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, it really doesn't make a sound.
No. Well, you make philosophy sound a bit frustrating. It's a bit like bashing your head continually against the wall of impossible solutions.
Yeah, I can appreciate that it will, at first blush at least, it will sound like a deflationary theory in some ways. You know, you will think, oh, well, in that case, what's the point, right? That would be a natural response to that. But in a way, I've come to think of it as really quite exhilarating in a way, to be, it's a Socratic idea, I suppose, to be able to trace the contours of your ignorance, you know, to know the limits, to know what it's possible to know, and to know what it's not possible to know, and to find out why that should be the case. And I'm using words like know and truth and all the rest of it, but these are almost terms of art in a way. They're not quite. I mean, they do have meaning, but they're, you know, I don't mean that we infallibly know these things. I just mean that we can probe them. We can see philosophy. There's another thing I didn't mention. The philosophy, at least in the analytic tradition, proceeds by what's called conceptual analysis. So you have it's an a priori science, really, instead of empiricism, which is an a posteriori science. What you do as a philosopher is you reflect on the necessary and sufficient conditions of the concepts that we all have at our disposal. And you can find out things that are true about the extra mental world, the external world, by means of conceptual analysis. Since concepts are about the world often, and whatever it is that provides the match between the property out there in the world and the property that's individuating the concept, it's not a coincidence. It's the same property doing the work. So our concepts are, you know, whatever it is that makes your concept of, I don't know, square the same as my concept of square is the very same property that makes square things the square things they are, as opposed to triangular, say, or rectangular. You know, and it's the age-old Platonic question about how do you derive the general from particular instances? You know, all we ever experience are particular instances of this, that, or the other. And yet we have this conceptual armory of general purpose concepts that we can deploy and attain some measure of truth through their deployment.
Well, I've got something to bring to this, because I think, first of all, you talked about conceptualizing the internal. And of course, the theory of mind comes in here, because we're isolated, aren't we? We can't actually plug into another person's consciousness, perceptions. I can't feel your pain, and you can't feel my, I don't know, orgasm, perhaps, because we are individually separated. But the only thing that we can do is talk about things and use our communication ability, our language, to share ideas. And we do that when we say, this is what I mean by a square, as you were saying. But then you went on to say that somehow or other, you recognize that there's also an external world, which we can come up with constructs that we match to the external world. And so I like to think of these as two separate realms. The conceptual realm See, I'm a retired science teacher, so I like to think that in here we come up with ideas, and then out there we observe whether or not they match reality.
Yeah.
You have,
I'm actually in the. It's a very old tradition, but I'm a what you would call a, well, it used to be called the rationalists. I'm what you might call a nativist. I think a great deal of what we end up knowing, we know innately. I think the job of a teacher is to sort of bring out or tease out the innate knowledge by proper environmental stimulation of what's already inside, especially things like mathematical knowledge and so on.
yeah.
But
Okay. Well,
which is not to deny the point that there is knowledge that we can only acquire by experience. Of course, that's true.
Well,
but
I'm comfortable with innateness because I think that several 100,000 years, if not millions of years of evolution have produced an organ in our heads, which does come with some software already loaded.
Yeah.
And then when we become aware and start feeding inputs into it from our sense organs, we can modify that preloaded, what would you call it in computing terms? The basic, the bottom software which operates the incoming data and puts it into, I don't know, categories and similar things and so on and so forth. But
even those categories have to be defined in order that they can be used, and they don't seem to be defined by the environment.
Some do and some don't. The categories like similar and different, they're preloaded, I would say.
Yeah, that's right. That's the logical property of identity. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. But other categories like, mammal, we've invented that and we've decided what it should be like because it's convenient for us to be able to talk about a group of animals that are similar.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I think that's true. I think, things like, musical instrument or, mammal, as you say, or, these kind of what you might think of as complex concepts. They're derivable from simpler elements.
Yes.
And so it's the simpler elements that I would say are innately given. I think Pinker puts the same point by saying that you have to have, in order to learn something, you have to have machinery capable of learning. So that's got to be innate. Something's got to be innate. You can't have. It's not like the old. I think John Locke, who was an empiricist, thought that he was the first to come up with the idea of the tabula rasa. The blank canvas on which the environment writes all of the knowledge. But it's just a metaphor, and even a blank page is composed of stuff. It's not even a very good metaphor.
No, I don't think it's as blank as he might have wished us to think. But what I was going on to say is it's very tempting now to delve into morality, isn't it? Because if we have this innateness, does it include innate behaviors that prompt us to cooperate rather than kill each other?
Yeah. Well, what can I say about that? I mean, I think that sounds like it's on the side of truth. Yeah. But there is the question of morality kind of supervenes on top of all of that. It's not just the question of, well, how do we behave? Is it cooperative? We're a social species, so it would be surprising if it were not cooperative. But really, it's the question of, is it good to do that? Is it good? Ought we to do it? Not for pragmatic reasons, not for survival or whatever, but ought we to do it for its own sake? That's what morality. That's where it comes in and asks the question. So that's a harder question to tackle. Really, it doesn't seem to have I mean, if anything about morality has a biological basis, it's just our grasp of it. Our evolved capacity to appreciate it, to tell whether something's good or bad, to tell whether it's morally neutral, whether it doesn't matter or not. That capacity, which is sometimes lacking in people due to pathology. Sometimes it's better in some people than in others, because you have variation in the species. Not everybody's equally talented at knowing this or knowing that. But that capacity, it strikes me, must be biological. It can't be anything else, right? It's a biological trait. But And I think you're right in one sense. That's quite important. I think our moral sense, it could be seen as a kind of spandrel, as a kind of byproduct of something else that has an adaptive advantage, something like our folk psychology, our innate ability to tell what's on each other's mind through behavior. We can guess more or less reliably the mental states of others based on their behavior. And so, if I have the concept of pain and I have the concept of individual persons, then it's virtually impossible for me not to realize that when you're in pain, it's a bad thing too. And that kind of thing. I mean, that doesn't say that pain is bad, and that doesn't say that anything about inflicting deliberate pain on an innocent is bad.
I'm sure we're going to come on to value judgments in a minute.
Yeah, the two things seem to go hand in hand, is my point.
Yeah, but this crosses the boundaries between species too, doesn't it? Because if you've ever had a dog, you'll know that it offers you sympathy if it sees you in pain.
Yeah, well, I don't know that firsthand because I've never had a dog. I'm what they call a cat person. In fact, my cat's just walked in right now. But I believe that's true, and it's hard to know what to make of that, other than to interpret it in the terms that you've just described. We are, as you said at the beginning, we are sealed off. My consciousness is sealed off from yours and from every other creature. It's conscious mental states are accessible in two ways, just two ways. Introspection, which is in private and first-person only access, and by rational inference from behavior. Yes. That is it. You can't look at the brain of a creature and know what its conscious mental states are. I know there's some sophisticated neurology now neuroscience that says we can tell what color a person's looking at and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, you literally, well, put it another way. Mental states have a property that brain states lack, viz. The ability for us to read from behavior what they are. I can tell from your behavior what's on your mind, but I cannot tell from your behavior what your brain state is right now. And there's no way I ever could. And that property is essential in a way because it's governed by a rationality constraint that has no applicability to the internal physical states of an organism, but it governs the semantic theory of mental attributions to creatures on the strength of how they behave, what they do, and so on. So in a way, behavior is an indefeasible. It gives us indefeasible access to the mental states of others. That is to say, it can't be usurped by, specialization in neurophysiology, for example. It's not like we defer to a clique of experts in neuroscience every time we want to work out what's on a creature's mind. That just isn't the way it works. That's actually something I wanted to talk about later, but we may skip it, I suppose.
We got stuck on this one.
Yeah.
Will it become detectable one day? I mean, with the way neuroscience is going, and there are these skull caps that actually use light penetrating the skull, very intense light, but painlessly, so they can even use them on babies. And I had an interview a couple of years ago, I think, with a person who does this research. It's in the archive, you'll be able to see. But will we one day be able to detect, with that sort of equipment, that a person is presenting differently from the wicked thoughts that are happening in here? Will we be able to detect deception?
I suspect not. Well, you might to some extent and to some degree of reliability, but I think not reliably enough. And I think in principle there's a reason why you ought not to be able to do it, and it's an important reason, which is that it's something that Hilary Putnam, the philosopher, pointed out in 1967 and again in 1975, that mental states are multiply realizable. Okay, which is to say they're a bit like artifact properties. Like the chronometric properties of clocks, for example. There's no way to tell or to explain how it is that the sundial in my garden tells me it's 2:10 by reference to the physical structure in my wristwatch that's telling me it's also 2:10. There's nothing about the physical structure of one kind of clock that can explain the chronometric properties of a different kind of clock, you know. And mental states are like that. They're multiply realizable. They have to be, if you think about it. If it was just a one-on-one relation between the physical input and the mental state, they'd be totally inflexible and they would be incapable of doing the job they've evolved to do. The input conditions and the output conditions in terms of behavior are multiply realizable. So the reason I invoke that concept of multiple realizability, owing to Putnam, is that what it does is it precludes, this is quite a complex point to grasp, I suppose, but hopefully you can see, it precludes the idea of nomological necessity between the physical state and the resulting mental state. You see, you can, the idea that the physical state could in any way explain the resulting mental state. That's not to say that physicalism isn't true. In fact, philosophers like Donald Davidson deduced physicalism from this idea. But it is to say that whilst you cannot have that particular physical state and without having that particular mental state, you nevertheless can have that particular mental state without having that physical state. It's not a two-way causation. It doesn't generalize. The necessity, you can give a sufficient condition for a particular mental state in physical terms, but you can't give a necessary condition for a mental state in terms of a particular physical condition, owing to multiple realizability, right?
Well, that's interesting, but you see, I wonder whether it is possible to have any necessary state, or have we just conceived of it?
Well, that's the thing.
Surely in our experience, everything is contingent.
I know. I find it confusing too sometimes to think about, well, how can anything be necessary, right? If everything depends on something else, right? But there are a number of ways to tackle this question. One of the ways is to invoke God as a kind of heuristic, just in a purely heuristic capacity. I'm not saying I believe in God. I do believe in God. I believe he's fictional, but I don't. I'm invoking him purely heuristically here. Is to say that God, for example, could have made persons out of any material he wanted to. He didn't have to make them out of human beings. But he had no choice in the making of human beings. That was necessary, owing to the evolutionary history and the ancestry and so forth. That human beings turned out to be the creatures they are in terms of genetic structure and evolutionary history is something that qualifies the entity that we think of as human beings in a necessary way, in a way that doesn't apply to the notion of persons. Persons are not real. Their essence is, as the philosophers say, nominal. It's I can't think of a better example than that, really, straight off the top of my head. But there is a distinction to be made between necessity and contingency. Numbers are a good way of illustrating the point, I suppose. 2 plus 2 necessarily equals 4. Now, you know that, I know that, but neither of us knows how we know that exactly.
I've got some theories on this.
Okay.
Well, I'm a naturalist or a materialist. I'm never quite sure what the difference is, but my view is that numbers are fabricated. We've made them up for our own convenience. The only number that actually exists in reality, in the natural realm, outside of our isolated crania, is 1. And 1 exists because the universe is quantized. So each of those dots is a 1. But grouping them together for our convenience and giving them a name for that particular quantity is a human fabrication, a very useful human fabrication. But I don't think that numbers actually exist.
Well, I'm aware of other philosophers who think exactly like you do. Fictionalism about numbers is a popular idea, sometimes called constructivism. Of course, one wants to know, well, what are they constructed out of? How does everyone have the same knowledge? How is that acquired? How is it possible to quantize anything without the prior conception of number? All these questions start to rear themselves when we imagine that they're just made up, that they're fictional. What's the standard of correctness? How did that become so universal? There's a lot of issues with that. It's not to say it's not refutable, really. I mean, it's an idea like any other philosophical idea, and it should be subject to scrutiny like any other idea. I'm not persuaded by it. I think it's, especially as a realist, which is something I on the first slide there, I didn't really get around to explaining what the difference between realism and anti-realism is. Your theory about numbers is an anti-realistic theory. It says that numbers can be defined in other terms, that the truth conditions of, if there are truth conditions to sentences about number, then they are expressible in terms of sentences that aren't about number. Whereas the realist would say that the truth conditions of sentences about number, in some sense, this is an idea owing to, I better get the credit in properly, owing to the now, which philosopher was it? It wasn't Putnam. Michael Dummett. It's Michael Dummett who formulated this idea about realism, that the realist would argue about number, for example, that sentences about numbers, their truth conditions, whatever it is that makes them true, transcends our ability to recognize what makes them true, or our ability to verify, or our ability to assert what makes them true. So truth transcends verification conditions. That was the way he put it.
Wow.
Yeah. So that we can know things without knowing how we know them. That some of our knowledge is just given to us. There's a Chomskyan idea that taps into this as well. That's kind of, it's not a justification for the position, but it kind of hints at the kind of thing that's going on. If you think about language faculty and our knowledge of how to acquire a language, it's pre-programmed, it's built in, it's innate. And one mark of that, one thing you can look at in the world and say, that's the mark of innate knowledge, is the poverty of stimulus versus the richness of result and the uniformity of basic principles. If you see that kind of thing in the world, then you being exhibited through epistemic capacities, then you can pretty much be assured that it's innately programmed. So logic and numbers and so on have this. You can't get the general idea of an infinitude of numbers from particular instances. In fact, numbers are not even identical to parsings of objects in the visual field, for instance. You can't begin to predicate non-identity of indiscernibility of individuals without some idea of what a number is.
What you're saying is you may have 5 apples, but
it's just some apples.
Apples are physical objects, and 5 isn't. It's purely abstract.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. Thank you. You're much better at explaining things than I am. But it's purely abstract. But it's abstract knowledge. It's knowledge of an abstract thing. An even more extreme way to make the same point is to say that you and I both know that if 16 weren't divisible by 2, then it would not be divisible by 4. Now, that's a counterfactual with an impossible antecedent. There's no such thing as 16 not being divisible by 2, right? So there's nothing in the world, even in the abstract world, that could qualify our knowledge in any way. And yet we both know that's true. And you can't use examples of counting things, counting algorithms or parsing objects in order to defend that knowledge or justify it in any way or explain its possibility, because it's completely impossible. So we know impossible truths about number.
Sure, but we might disagree about what we mean by truth here, because coming from my scientific background, I first of all, I don't believe that there is any absolute truth, because in a universe that contains time, everything is relative, because it's all moving and changing constantly. You can't stop time, so everything is relative. There is no absolute truth. That's the first problem. The next thing is, how do we confirm the veracity of an item of truth? And I would say here that the only authority that we have is the cosmos. So we make our proposition, and to find out if it's true or not, we hold it up against the cosmos and see whether we get congruent observations.
Yeah. That all makes sense to me, and it's, if I dare I say, it sounds like it's on the side of truth. But
Pun intended.
Yeah. There is an issue with truth. Truth is, as far as I can see, it's a logical property, just like identity, necessity, predication, possibility, existence is another one in the same sort of category. It's a logical property that is very unusual in many ways. I think Tarski's idea of disquotationalism is correct. I think it provides a correct basis for a theory of truth. It doesn't allow us to tell what's true. Of course, the theory of truth isn't like a lie detector. It doesn't allow us to tell what's true in the world, but it tells us something about what truth is and how it works. And disquotationalism seems to me to be correct. And the remarkable thing about disquotationalism, about the theory of truth, is that the way in which it can be, unlike any other logical property, it can be non-circularly, necessarily and sufficiently defined, which is to say it allows for, most logical properties like existence or necessity or identity, you can't define them in a way that admits of non-circularity. You have to use the concept being defined in order to say anything about the concept. That often infuriates non-philosophers, because they think, oh, well, in that case, you haven't explained anything. It's all viciously circular. Of course, there's nothing vicious about it. You've just hit conceptual bedrock. Whereas in the case of truth, we have a good way, namely disquotationalism, of necessarily and sufficiently giving all the necessary sufficient conditions for the truth of a proposition without making any reference to truth. So it's non-circular. So to pick on a particular example, for example, if I say, if I use the proposition, you and I are discussing things right now, that proposition is true by disquotation if and only if you and I are discussing things right now. That's how it works, right? Well, the right-hand side of the biconditional, you see, makes no reference to truth. All it does is gives necessary and sufficient conditions for the truth of the proposition.
There you see, I would comment there that what we're doing is entirely in the conceptual realm. With it's thought, it's in here. I've got my isolated brain, you've got your isolated brain. We're trying to communicate between the two with our words and other means, gestures, for example. But do we have, here's a question, do we have any right to be able to solve mysteries? Because we're like ants looking up at the universe, having our ideas and saying, well, I wonder if this idea fits, Newton's laws were pretty good, but relativity is a bit better, and I think that the universe is the authority. The actual natural realm is the authority, and we're puny little things trying to solve it. We've got I think that thought is subservient to observations.
Well, I agree with everything you said, right up until that last bit. But not in an unqualified way, and not too harshly either. I don't want to,
Go ahead.
I don't want to be contrarian all the time, But I first of all, on your first series of points, I think you're right. I think you can't derive an ontological conclusion from epistemological premises. Basically, the case. We are finite creatures. We evolved. We're as constrained and limited by evolutionary trade-offs over eons as any other evolved trait exhibited by any other creature must be. And so, philosophy is all about, as I said, just trying to trace the contours of those limits. Where are they? What do they look like? How will we know, etc. So we are limited. Incidentally, your point about Newton and then Einstein, that's interesting, because Newton's a big hero of mine. I think he was a Mysterian, especially about motion. Yes. I mean, he acknowledged the mystery quite plainly, and if you read the Principia, he's very, very commendably clear on the topic. Actually, that motion is whatever real motion is. Well, he doesn't use terms like relative and so on, but he's well aware that whatever real motion is, it's not relative.
He was a fantastic thinker who also was a sort of unusual type of Christian, and he tried to poke his eyeball out. He was a wonderful guy.
Extraordinary, bad-tempered man, by all accounts. A real genius. But to your latter point, how can I criticize that fairly? I think. See, I'm what philosophers call an externalist. I believe that mental content is, in a certain sense that's not easy to make clear in the short amount of time we have left, is individuated or configured, if you like, by the environment. That we have a lot of innate stuff going on, but also the environment itself contains, energy states and objects, matter, stuff, motion, whether it's relative or absolute. In some sense, we can't coherently make sense of. It contains all of these things, and our cognition, our concepts in particular, are given the content they have by whatever properties it is that make those things the things they are. The error is possible, but it's especially a posteriori error is possible. But you can only correct that by noticing that the thing you thought had the property you thought it had doesn't have the property you thought it had.
Yes, it's falsification. You're talking about falsification now. Yes. Well, you're right. We're coming up to the end of our time, and we've enjoyed it so much. We haven't covered much.
We didn't even get onto the topic of ethical value, which is a shame.
We've just got enough time. I'm going to play that clip I showed you earlier, because this debater talks about value as solving his problems of confusion that he had that gave him a mental condition. So this was somebody I debated with several years ago. You'll see as a younger me when they turn the camera on me.
So I thought, you know what? Maybe value is what I need to think about. Human life is valuable. It's sacred. We all acknowledge this. We all realize this. We all understand this. Even atheists and naturalists understand this. Humanism. It's based on one of the tenets, the fundamental tenets is that human life is sacred. It's valuable. So I said, you know what? I have no purpose to live, but life being valuable, that should be enough to keep me going. Well, when I inquired and I thought about the question of value, you soon realize that again on atheism and naturalism, there is no special value to human life. Now, let me just give you guys an example just to put things into perspective. We have a pen here, a very nice Manchester University, I believe it's by someone else. Or whoever it's by. It's a nice little purple pen in my hand, right? If I was to ask you guys, what's more valuable, me or this pen? What would you say? I want you to think about it for a second. Most of us, hopefully all of us, would say, well, you're more valuable, right? Imagine if I put you guys in a situation and I said, look, or imagine hypothetically for a second that you guys suffer from a particular condition. You have an anger problem which can't be resolved by any medication. So what the doctors told you is that whenever you get angry, you have to express your anger. And to do that, he's given you a hammer to carry around with you. Okay? I know it's a bit of a crazy example, but just go with it for a second, yeah? You've got a hammer in your pocket. And imagine for some reason you get really angry right now, and you have a choice to make. You have a choice to make between smashing me as a human being and smashing this pen. What would you smash? It's a question. What would you guys smash? Yeah, hopefully everyone will say the pen, right?
I love the way he doesn't get a response.
Yeah.
What he's asking for there is the opinions of people. And it's like his example, I mean, there are people who get cross and punch a wall, aren't there? But what does that tell us? It doesn't solve anything.
It's hard to fathom what's going on there. At least he acknowledged that he knows it's a bit of a crazy example.
Yes.
I mean, I think the only thing to say about it is that it's a non sequitur. I mean, how can you derive the conclusion that life is or isn't valuable from a premise about a fictional being? Or about, he's saying that you can derive a conclusion about the value of a life, whether that value is intrinsic or well, I suppose he's saying that it must be extrinsic to life, because he's claiming that unless you have God, you don't have any value in your life. I think the thing to say about that is it's non sequitur, and you can in fact derive value intrinsically from life. The value of life is intrinsic to life. There are many things in life that are valuable. They don't need validation from anything outside.
No, indeed. Well, if you accept biology, then and you accept that we're social animals and we achieve by cooperating. I mean, the Great Wall of China and the helicopter on Mars, they were achieved by men cooperating with a joint mission. There was no need to invoke any supernatural agent at all. But the point is that value is a subjective judgment.
Oh,
and
you've come at me with that one in the last minute and a half.
Oh.
I could spend an hour disagreeing with you about that.
Next time.
The thing to say about that is I would be careful to separate values from evaluations. So values are not judgments. Judgments are psychological. Values are what we judge to obtain. But that is a whole other podcast, and I'd be delighted to discuss that with you. Absolutely delighted.
Excellent. We'll do that another day then. Yes, because I do like to keep the timing true. It's called Free Thought Hour. I want that to be true. No, otherwise I won't get any more fish to come to my pool. They will fear that they're going to be trapped. Anyway, I want to flag up that next week our guest will be from South Africa. He's an interesting guy called Charles Webster, and he has undergone a journey because, he'll tell you next week. I'm not sure of the details of it, but I know that he's clambered out of Christianity. So we'll look forward to hearing that from his mouth next week.
Quite a story, I'm sure. Yeah.
So thank you to the viewers who have given us a couple of comments. Thank you to future viewers who will watch this as a podcast when we stop live streaming. And thank you most of all to Alan, who continues to impress me with his intellect. It's phenomenal.
It's my pleasure and my privilege. I honestly, I appreciate the invite, and I'm glad to be here with you. And I'll do it anytime.
I'm standing on a stepladder to try and match his cleverness.
Oh, shucks.
Anyway, thank you, Alan. I look forward to having another chat with you another day.
Oh, it's been delightful. Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it.
I've got your outro here. Watch the names go up. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.